Excellent. Thank you for the kind introduction, Onesimus, and welcome everybody to a seminar, for lack of a better word, on the satellite charmer, extractivism, and the larger geopolitics at play. We started a little late, so I don't know if we're going to have an extra 20 minutes to make up for the lost time, but maybe, Onesimus, you can confirm.
Yes, we will. We will have an
We
extra
will.
20 minutes for. We are
Excellent.
recording the session anyway. Yeah.
That's perfect, perfect. And I see that some of you have their microphones on. If I'd be grateful if you could turn them off, so that there are no interruptions while we try to make up for lost time. So good afternoon again, wherever you're coming from, and welcome to the seminar hosted by the Imperial Center for Environmental Policy on the satellite charmer, extractivism, and the larger geopolitics. Onesimus, slide 2, please. So my name is Mame Bougouma Diene. My biggest and only claim to fame being the Kane Prize 2023, which I'm happy to discuss later, although it's completely off topic. I'm an author and editor, or say some biographies, as Onesimus just did, so I guess it must be true. And in my day job, I work full-time for the United Nations, but for multiple reasons, I cannot discuss the ins and outs of work, even as they pertain to the topic at play today. Heartbreakingly enough, the uptake in violence in the Kivus and the DRC, through all of which will be discussed today, into the public sphere, so at least there are no conflicts of interest. So today we'll be looking at the satellite charmer, genesis and concepts, not going into much detail about the story itself. We'll keep that for the Q&A. Corporatism and the 21st century, extractivism and current geopolitics. First, looking at the environmental impacts of extractivism in South Africa and the DRC, the human and geopolitical impact of extractivism in Myanmar, Niger, Ukraine, and the DRC. And then finally, veering back towards speculative fiction and looking at extractivism as the fuel for revolution through the prisms. Excuse me, the weather is a little bit cold in the car, a little bit windy, and I have a 4-year-old daughter. Through the prisms of Dune, The Expanse, and then finally looking at where all the above leads us more broadly as a society. Onesimus, slide 3, please. So where do we begin? Well, the satellite charmer and its overt focus on satellite mining in a world split between allegiances to two corporate mega Chinas seems about right. What you read as the satellite charmer, for those of you who have, is actually the 4th or 5th iteration of a story that was inspired by some graffiti art 12 or 13 years ago now. It was a real brief collection of loose vignettes as a piece of flash, somewhere around 1,000 words, maybe less, that was rejected 2 or 3 times before I shelved it. Then eventually I turned it into a 250-word flash piece for Short Story Day Africa's writer prompt. And then it became part of a planned trilogy of novellas that were initially called Apes and Satellites, Widows and Warriors, and finally the Satellite Charmer. Guess what? The trilogy never happened, but I had the first parts drafted, and bits of the second novella. So those eventually became both Apes and Satellites, the short story, and the Satellite Charmer, the novelette. So in the meantime, I took the ape portion from Apes and Satellites and subbed it to brittle paper, and that became a prequel to the Satellite Charmer eventually, but not until I had published Ogotameli's song in Afro SF Volume 3, which kind of works as an alternative ending to the Satellite Charmer, and published Another Day in the Desert with Escape Pod as a prequel to the Satellite Charmer, with only very loose connections. And eventually, over the course of 2 grueling years, I finally landed the Satellite Charmer in its current form, which incorporates the storyline from the flash fiction piece years prior and a chunk of Widows and Warriors that I never fully completed. And that version was eventually translated into Italian and illustrated and reprinted in Apex magazine. I hated writing most of it and hated it when I was done. I honestly had no idea it would do so well, at least critically. The bottom image in the corner is from the broken nose in Omenana, which happens in the same universe as a satellite charmer, but has no direct connections with it at all. So, as the adage goes, never give up on your work. The piece of graffiti art with a little alien dude playing a cello to a bunch of dancing satellites came a long way over the course of a decade or more. The original drawing had nothing to do with either corporatism or extractivism at all. It was just a fun little ditty. But it inspired this vision with larger geopolitics and human transformation and heartbreak and loss that eventually became the satellite charmer in its current form. And I'm happy I'm happy to discuss that later. And as it turns out, a lot of my written work deals with corporatism, environmental collapse, and extractivism. So there's probably more to be discussed in the Q&A. Oh, and I'm forgetting there's actually another story set in that universe that I never bothered to submit that deals with a female drug lord in the Congos. And I can't even remember what the story's called right now, but happy to talk about it more later. Onesimus, over to you for slide 4. All right. So here is one of the many random world maps you can find online. It delineates nation states as we know them. It has been more or less stable for a couple of decades, save some minor occasional shifts. It wasn't chosen for any particular reason or feature, but to beg the question, while this is the world as we are taught, is it the world as it actually matters? Slide 5, please. Now, I will argue that it doesn't. In my mind, and not because I think it's a good or a bad thing, but I'll argue that either of the maps above are more reflective of the reality we live in than the world map as we know it. Because while we vote and choose our leaders based on the world map and relatively stable borders, our elected leaders base their decisions based on the above: natural resources, energy, and minerals. A number of people are no fans of the current president of the United States and wonder how he could rise to office not just once, but twice, with more votes than Barack Obama. But historically, if you think about it, he was inevitable. It really should not come as a surprise that a global capitalist system comes eventually to be run by a person who embodies a global capitalist system. It's the most natural and logical thing you can imagine. Trump is where he is because the world is where it's at. Resources and the stock market drive the world as we know it. It's important to watch the national news, but believe me, it's just as important to watch business channels like Bloomberg that will give you a business perspective on things. Because there you'll get the information pertaining to the leadership that drives your countries. And business news can be super confusing at first. It was for me, but you get the hang of it eventually. Even the way POTUS is governing the US right now is very much a businessman's approach, executive and profit-driven. I've often argued that as a nation, we're not a country, but a giant corporation with football teams. And it's never been truer than now. Drill, baby, drill, Ukraine, DRC, Greenland. It's all a rush to secure energy supplies. Slide 6, please. So looking at the environmental impacts of extractivism, we're not going to look at all the environmental impacts of extractivism in the countries highlighted today, just some of the more spectacular. Starting with South Africa. So South Africa is famous for its diamond and gold mines. They are hugely attractive to foreign labor, the going joke being that half of Lesotho is digging in the Orange Free State right now, as we speak. It's not the funniest joke, but it's the going joke. Mining is a major reason for the country's attractiveness under colonization and apartheid, and Johannesburg, Gauteng is one of the major mining centers. Because there was so much mining activity, legal or otherwise, especially in South Johannesburg, Johannesburg is now an epicenter for local seismic activity. It is minor, quote unquote, but you can feel the aftershocks all the way to Pretoria, 30 miles away. My wife woke me up to one night, but I was sleeping. I felt nothing at all and said it must have been a nightmare. I found out the following morning that it was actually an aftershock from from an earthquake in Johannesburg. Unsurprisingly enough, half the guys in my office were also asleep and said the same thing to their wives. So gentlemen, listen to your wives. And another more immediate problem is illegal mining directly under the central business district in Johannesburg. The second picture was taken after an explosion underground and the consequent collapse seen on screen. So it's relative to Johannesburg and relative to South Africa, extractivism is both a past and present problem with immediate repercussions, both connected to the past, but also connected to the illegal activity underway and probably underway and underground as we speak right now. Looking at the DRC, we're going to look at the DRC a couple of times, but right now we're going to look at environment and a lot of the misunderstandings around the conflicts, lack of development, environmental impacts, and what that means for global warming, the international system, and of course the DRC's economy. In December 2023, The Atlantic released an article called The Grim Ironies of Climate Change, which was originally titled, War in the Congo Has Kept the Planet Cooler. I'm sure most of you have either read the article or heard about it. And it was focused on the impact of the sequential Congolese wars and the purportedly beneficial impact on rainforest exploitation, arguing, not entirely wrongfully, that the conflict made it more difficult for large-scale exploitation of the rainforest to occur. It raised an immediate storm of accusations of callousness, minimizing the value of African lives, and disparaging African deaths. I didn't think the article did that personally. I just thought it raised the very valid point that anything that curtails human activity is great for the environment, which should be obvious by now. We've all lived through COVID. Less people means less pollution and a healthier environment. Choosing the Congolese wars was just a really poor example. Now, Brittle Paper published an admittedly long open letter rebuking many of the Atlantic's claims. And for very right reasons. The war has actually a tremendous environmental impact, directly connected to mineral exploitation. Displaced populations exert immense pressures on resources and often occupy the same space as natural preserves that armed groups exploit for fauna and flora, all of which are smuggled into neighboring countries and sold as local products. A major biodiversity and revenue loss for the DRC. In addition, it's not just the conflict that limits access, but also limited development in the DRC. The lack of roads to access all these natural preserves is probably a stronger, more indicative of why there is less resource exploitation in the DRC, at least fauna and flora wise and rainforest wise, than the conflict. The conflict is just a much more sensational entry point, and I think our author at The Atlantic confused sensationalism with truth for a while. But we can get into that a little bit later, and we will get into the larger geopolitics in a few slides from now. So looking at human, slide number 8, Onesimus. So looking at the human and geopolitical impact of extractivism, starting with Myanmar. So, I mean, we're trying to go, I'm not just focusing on Africa for this presentation, obviously, because there are a lot of different examples all over the world where politics, extractivism, ethnic oppression, rebellions take different forms for different reasons. And it's important to have an oversight of it all in order to focus better on the issues that to our own homes. So we're going to start with Myanmar, largely because, in my opinion, this was something that was underlooked. And while there are no academic articles looking at this aspect of things, I think it's important to mention, if just to keep in the back of our minds. So Myanmar, former Burma, is the stage for large-scale human displacement into neighboring Bangladesh. There are ethnic tensions between the majority Buddhist and the Rohingya minority. who are accused of being ethnic Bangladeshis, infiltrators, and terrorists. Military reprisals led to a refugee crisis of over 1 million people since 2016, 2017, much of which has not been addressed now. I think the Burmese government just recently authorized roughly 150,000 people to return, having identified them as actual Burmese citizens. None of this is new. Rohingya are persecuted in Myanmar since independence, denied citizenship. I think it was Archbishop Desmond Tutu who compared the situation to apartheid. I think more recently Malala Yousafzai has said the same thing. And the Pope has also tried to bring it up with Aung San Suu Kyi with no results that anyone can measure. So these are long-running tensions, long-running violence, and the 2016-2017 resurgence in violence did not occur in a vacuum, but is very much part of a historical continuity. But while the tensions are overtly over ethnicity and religion, in my opinion, at the very least, there might be other interests at play. And this was brought up by a friend who had just come back from Southeast Asia recently, at the time, and who told me, look, I don't know about you, man, but those maps between Rohingya displacement and the Chinese pipeline plans overlap almost perfectly, which got me thinking, he's not entirely wrong. If you look at the Rohingya displacement areas in Rakhine State, you'll notice, looking at the section picture, that they just happen to overlap with the Chinese pipeline running through Myanmar into the Bay of Bengal. This may simply be a case of politics and business overlapping coincidentally. It just as well may not. The initial work on the pipeline may have exacerbated tensions, requests for economic participation or compensation on behalf of the Rohingya. Environmental and livelihood concerns, fueling the rebellion, increasing retaliation, and on and on and on we go. Not directly connected to the Rohingya, but the pipeline was also, Myanmar has multiple ethnic groups and multiple claims to independence at play at the same time. And other parts of the country that are also affected by the pipeline also have active rebellions where the pipeline became an issue. So even as the whole Rohingya struggle doesn't happen in the vacuum, issues related to extractivism and the pipeline and environmental concerns are not happening in a vacuum in Myanmar, in other parts of Myanmar either. Now, I haven't come across any articles or research papers looking at this in depth, as I said before. So while I can only present this as speculation on my part, I think it's still a striking coincidence and possibly something to look into if any of you have it in their hearts, and if anybody's listening in from Myanmar, which would be great. Now, slide number 9, please, Onesimus. Niger. Well, I will not be looking at the health and environmental impacts of uranium mines located in Arlit in northern Agadez, in northern Niger, because that would be a presentation in and of itself. There are also numerous gold mines bordering Libya, but we will not be looking into those either. There's only so much time after all, and I'm trying to make up for lost time. Sorry if I'm kind of speed rushing through this, but we need to get to this and get to the questions. So I'll just skim briefly over the impact of recent political changes in Niger, the expulsion of France, and what it means mostly for France. So I used to live in Agadez in 2013, and at the time it was estimated that roughly 25 to 30% of French electricity relied on uranium extracted from the Arlit mines. So France is one of the countries relying on nuclear energy for its electric supply, clean nuclear energy, which works incredibly well, as it turns out. What it did not see coming was the reversal in fortune after the overthrow of the previous president by a military coup, and the domino effect ranging from Mali through Niger to Burkina Faso, and further losses of military bases in long-running partner Chad, and currently underway in Senegal. The situation is not looking up for France and West Africa, in other words. And it was expected to be a major setback for France. That said, within a few months, France signed a deal with Mongolia to procure uranium, mine for lithium, and other rare earths, much to the upset of many people. But it worked out pretty well for France, and in a place where historical complications wouldn't weigh on its agreements. This is to say that while being resource rich does give you an edge, you're not the only actor or player in that space. And depending on what your political leanings are, developing the partnerships, looking at long-lasting partnerships, it becomes incredibly important right from the start to make sure that any deals that are signed, especially international deals that tend to be exploitative in the first place, third world, first world in relation, are as fair as possible to the local population. Our elite has been contentious for the Nigerian population for years. Even in 2013, as there were terror attacks in Agadez, a couple of weeks after I got there, the real point of the attacks in Agadez were to divert attention from the attacks ongoing on the uranium mines in Arlit. As soon as those happened, the Nigerian president traveled to France immediately to reassure the French government that everything was back under control and they would have full access to the Arlit uranium mines again, which prompted further discontent within the Nigerian population. So those are things that tend to feed into each other and have consequences that are not felt right the moment where the incidents happen, but 10 or 15 years down the line. And of course, when you're in France, you're in a much better position to navigate those things and find other partners. When you're Niger, things get a little bit more complicated. Slide number 10, please. Looking at Ukraine. We're all familiar with the war in Ukraine. Those of us who live in the West, a lot more so. The war in Ukraine has been brewing for decades. This is not anything new. The country's politics, depending largely on whether Western or Russian influence was greatest and who could hold a grip on power the longest. The recent conflagration happened under guise of Russian national security. And with the Trump administration, the conversation shifted entirely into resources, critical raw minerals in particular. Now, it's hard for me to believe that natural resources didn't play a part in Russia's larger goals in Ukraine from the jump. They certainly played a part in South Ossetia and Georgia a few years ago. If you recall, Russian tanks rolled into South Ossetia and Abkhazia in Georgia, claiming to be defending Russian-speaking populations and regions that were interested in separatism and then joining the Russian Federation. That said, South Ossetia was incredibly resource-rich and had a population of barely 57,000 people, with only 0.7 of which were ethnic Russians. So the argument doesn't hold water. The region had been under dispute for a time, but again, the Russian incursion followed the same pattern of national security claims. But now, if you look at the maps, just to draw a parallel with Ukraine, if you look at the maps above and the overlap in territory under Russian control in red and regained by Ukrainian forces, you'll notice a number of active mining areas that appear in the second map. Obviously, the pattern of the invasion follows geographical borders. Those borders are awfully convenient, and if they weren't, the current US administration wouldn't have much interest in them either. There was concern a couple of years ago that Russia would open another front into Ukraine through Moldova, cutting the country in half through the middle. And that front, had it materialized, would have cut across all of central Ukraine's mining areas. So again, nothing that's being studied now, at least academically, because operations are still underway, because there's a lot of major political shifts and interest in Ukraine. But it would be interesting to look a bit further into Russia's needs in relation to critical raw minerals, energy, and how much of its expansionist policies are connected to that versus national security and Russian ethnicity, as it so claims. Slide number 11, please, Onesmus. Hold on, my daughter is asking for me. She can hear me talk. Okay, her mother just took her away. Oh, no, she's knocking at the door. I hope her mother will take her away for everybody's sake. So now we're looking at the human and geopolitical impact of extractivism in the DRC specifically. And looking more specifically at the incidents on regional competition and conflicts when you're that resource rich with porous and undersecured borders. So now the most obvious and most contentious issue at the moment, and probably for a number of years, is related to coltan extraction and the resurgence in violence by the allegedly Rwandan and more recently Ugandan-backed armed group M23 and the horrific violence in the Kivus. The Rubaya mines are again at the heart of the problem. Coltan is smuggled illegally into Rwanda out of the Kivus, both industrial coltan and artisanal coltan. The pictures above paint a very clear picture. Rwanda allegedly holds tantalum, the mineral coltan is extracted from, in reserves, but those are very minimal compared to the volume and grade of the tantalum extracted from the DRC. Yet somehow Rwanda is the first exporter in the world and has exported more coltan than the DRC 6 out of the last 10 years. And the graph does not account for artisanal coltan, which is harder to measure, which Rwanda accepts just as long as it goes through the refining process that sets Rwanda apart from the DRC. So while M23 grabbed the headlines for all the wrong reasons, armed groups and Rwandan forces are not the only reason why coltan is smuggled into Rwanda from the DRC. Corruption in supply chains in the DRC make Rwanda a much more attractive destination for coltan traders / traffickers, where it is refined to international grade standards and then exported. For a long time now, most Western nations were perfectly complicit in this fact, but it has become increasingly problematic. And most recently, the UK canceled its agreement over deportations with Rwanda over the violence in South Kivu. But then again, Rwanda are not the only actors in Eastern Congo. There are over 250 known armed groups operating there and multiple national and international forces. Nor is coltan the only resource smuggled out of the country. The DRC has enormous reserves in gold in the province of Ituri, north of the Kivus. And in Ituri, the Allied Democratic Forces, ADF for short, an Islamic State affiliate constituted mostly of Ugandan citizens, but expanding into Southern Africa, are the largest group operating there. The DRC gold, like coltan, is smuggled into Uganda and smuggled as Ugandan gold. Forestries and rare species of wood are smuggled south into Zambia and sold as Zambian forestries. Eastern DRC is a free-for-all, in other words. The point here, if it even needs making, is that we're all complicit, at least whichever ones of us have a smartphone. Please, next slide, Anespis. Back to speculative fiction and less political spaces. Now, looking at Dune, spice that we know as the fuel for galactic empire and for galactic imperial ambitions and space traveling really took off as a party drug before it became the most vital substance to galactic civilization. And by that I mean it really took off. Now, spice is dried up worm feces marinated in worm vomit. So it really proves that people will get high with absolutely anything. Aurelius Venport from Venki Enterprises commercialized spice recreationally, but it was his paramour, Nora McKenva, who realized its potential, imbibing so much of it in one sitting that she became the first navigator, turning the tide in the war against the thinking machines with enough prescience to use the space-folding engines that she created without relying on thinking machines or folding blind and risking all for a possible leap into the sun or a black hole. All this happened 10,000 years before Dune. So for those of you who haven't read the prequels, that's just a little backstory for you. But from that moment on, spice became absolutely vital to the empire. And most of us are familiar with the dance between the Carinos, Harkonnens, Atreides, Paul, Chani, Irulan, and a guy called Duncan Idaho, who, as it turns out, I will not spoil it for you. Paul, however, became a unifying factor in the Fremen's millennial resistance to imperial extractivism. Not for environmental reasons specifically. Damage on Arrakis is what we view as salvation on Earth. Neither are they resisting for financial reasons. The Fremen never saw profits from spice extraction, but for mystical reasons, much more rooted in Fremen culture than the Bene Gesserit Missionaria Productiva that ushered in Paul's godhead. It was the holiness of Shai Hulud and, of course, imperial brutality that led the Fremen to start an active resistance against the empire. And while they inflicted significant damage, restricting access to limited spicing grounds outside the deep desert, they were never a unified force or revolution. Caught in cyclical, self-cannibalizing, internecine struggles, all that until Paul arrived and let them loose upon the galaxy. Eventually, they turned on Paul and his progeny when they realized what they were doing. But without a unifying leader of their own, they could never become a real revolutionary force, only pawns for higher colonial ambitions. Slide number 13, please, Onesimus. And the Expanse. Ceres was once covered in ice, enough water for 1,000 generations, until Earth and Mars stripped it away for themselves. This station became the most vital port in the belt. But the immense wealth and resources that flow through our gates was never meant for us. They built their solar systems on our back, spilled the blood of 1 million of our brothers, but in their eyes, we're not even human anymore. Belters in the Expanse, for those who are familiar and for those who are not, it's possible. This is my favorite science fiction series of all time, so it becomes highly recommended by yours truly. But for those who are familiar, Belters in the Expanse are caught in a double bind in their relationship to the inners of Mars and Earth. On the one hand, they are reduced to expendable labor, and on the other, they're dehumanized by the physical adjustments to low gravity and vacuum that they've underwent for generations, which make Earth uninhabitable to them and most of the planets of the solar system. Now, there are some parallels between the Expanse and the Belters and Dune and the Fremen. Extreme isolation and adaptation to the harshest environments known to man, and more to the point of this discussion, a lack of cohesive leadership. There are essentially, just as there are Fremens, as many Belter identities as there are inhabited rocks and independent stations. Anderson Dawes runs the OPA out of Ceres. Fred Johnson runs it out of Psycho Station. It's only until firebrand Marco Inaros gets a grip on power that we come to a unified purpose forced upon the belt, which leads to Dakar's destruction by an asteroid, among other things. Again, if I'm spoiling the Expanse for you, I'm terribly sorry, but still watch it. There's plenty to love. I thought that was pretty cool. Finally, Dakar had gained enough recognition to be destroyed somewhere. But it was also incredibly problematic for other reasons. And those reasons should be obvious looking at the second picture in the middle below, if you can read the detail. And if you can't, I'm happy to discuss that afterwards. And finally, slide 14, Onesimus. Where does all this leave us? Nowhere good, unfortunately, unless the recent decisions by the US administration backfire against Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos. We're looking at more private sector involvement in space exploration over the next few years or decades. The last launch run exclusively by NASA without corporate involvement was in 2011. We're in 2025. Since then, SpaceX has gained major prominence, and Bezos' Blue Origins launched twice in 2021. We're all literally living under a Starlink web of satellites. Whether it is government or corporate, space exploration will be highly commercialized and resource-driven. We're already talking about mining minerals on the moon. If Amazon gets there first, it'll be Amazon's moon, and the first step into galactic corporatism. Not if it's a government, same difference really, except for the illusion of democratic involvement. The first to benefit will be the stock market, exactly as they do now. The question is, do we have enough revolution in us, or do we need a satellite charmer? And I thank you for your time.
Thanks, Mame. thanks for the wonderful presentation. I think it was quite eye-opening in terms of the whole geopolitical aspect associated with extractivism. Would like to open it for questions now. If you have any question, you can unmute and speak out, or if you want, you can put it in the chat, and we'll provide this to Mame to respond to. Any questions? Yeah, Mame. Yeah, there's one. Yeah, go on. Zafi, Dele?
Yes, thank you, Mame, for your fascinating presentation and the connections, that you've made between these trends. I have an observation in the chat. When you switched to Diene, and you were talking about the prequels and the opposition between the sort of thinking machines, which I liken to AI, which have emerged recently, and this sort of spice psychedelic substance, wherever it's from. There are lots of psychedelics, that have seen a resurgence again in recent times, after having previously been banned. I mean, do you see those parallels with what's happening now? And I know it's a sort of speculative question, but I mean, to what extent do you think, since logically normal people cannot compete against the corporates and the power and the technologies that they have at their disposal and are amassing, is the path of developing human perception and abilities a reasonable path for people to try and focus on as a way of resistance, and who knows, even a case of life imitating art, as happened in Diene.
Well, thank you. I don't want to mispronounce your name. Nzefi?
It's Neshapi. Neshapi.
Neshapi. Well, thank you for your question, Neshapi. I just also want to apologize to everybody for kind of rushing through the presentation. Yeah, I mean, when AI started becoming relevant to the arts a couple of years ago, it was derided, right? Look, they've got like 6 fingers instead of 5. Every single character in the picture looks exactly the same. And it was true for a while, and now we're like 3 years later, and it's become a whole lot better. If you think about it, 50, 60 years ago, computers were the size of buildings, and phones were the size of a computer. Now the phone is in your pocket and the computer is in your phone. Within a couple of years from now, AI-generated arts will be absolutely indistinguishable from human-generated art. A lot of magazines have noticed that, some have taken measures, very radical measures. And I'm not saying that radical in the wrong way. I'm just saying radical in the sense of we refuse anything that is drafted or produced with any kind of AI support. Other magazines are looking at the kind of quality they receive from human writers versus what they receive from AI writers, and they are baffled. they will tell you we have no means to actually verify because it's almost entirely similar already. And I think it was recently that a story came out that was drafted by an AI about being an AI, about emotion and lacking them. I've read the story, and to be honest with you, I'm pretty sure most magazines would have published that story if a human had sent it to them. So we're looking at something that is absolutely inevitable in terms of change. But also, we're already using artificial AI, artificial intelligence, um, already using artificial intelligence in a lot of our computing processes and technology. So there are multiple things that are happening. What's upsetting to me is the over commercialization of AI and what it's doing to dumb down humanity. All these startups and all these ads saying, hey, look, if you don't know how to do this, this is how you do it with AI. And that's a huge parallel with Doom, where the thinking machines are, yes, entirely artificial intelligence. It's just a more clever nomenclature than artificial intelligence. But what happens in Dune is eventually the reliance on the thinking machines makes humans completely apathetic and useless. And I mean, you've read the prequels, right? So you know exactly what happened to the Titans and what started their revolution. And how they came to dominate the thinking machines that humans were using until the thinking machines dominated them for exactly the same reasons as humanity lost control to the Titans, which is hedonistic self-involvement, which humans are naturally prey to, and only gets worse if it's facilitated for us. So looking at psychedelics in relation to that, well, psychedelics in Dune, the Fremen use them for mystical purposes, for inebriation as well. Then it became the vital element in using the space folding engines was really purely fortuitous. Really purely fortuitous. I mean, Norma Kenva was obviously intelligent enough to kind of foresee what could happen, but it was still purely fortuitous. Do I think that on our scale at a human level is necessarily the fuel for revolution for us? Maybe, maybe. In terms of keeping people aware of themselves. And maybe more aware of the world around them and the connections that they need to make, certainly. Do I think it will become a unifying factor in standing up to mega corporatism, to artificial intelligence and the abuse of artificial intelligence by mega corporatism? I really couldn't tell you. What I do know is that we've entered a phase of capitalism that is very different from what capitalism was originally envisaged as, where our focus is purely economic, purely resource-driven, purely technological, and far less human. But I do think that as long as humans we're happy with the toys that we're given, it's very unlikely we're going to do anything about it. When I said earlier that as the United States, as a country, we're not so much a nation, but a corporation with football teams, that's not just a joke. The reason for me that's pretty evident as to why there's never been actual revolution in the United States passing it past the British, is because, hockey season starts in November, ends in February. Then basketball season starts, then football season starts, and then that overlaps with hockey season, and baseball season runs 6 months out of the year. The Romans bred in circuses, essentially. And as long as there's bread, as long as there's circus, as long as we have our smartphones to keep us distracted, there's a fair chance that whoever's pulling the strings, and I'm not saying this in a conspiratorial tone or anything, but the very real people who are pulling the strings have really no reason to worry that there's going to be some uprising somewhere. That may or may not be true in the long run. Maybe I'm just being pessimistic. Obviously, There's been a lot of changes in Africa recently in relation to former colonial powers. But, you know, moving from France to Russia the answer to all your problems? Probably not. You know, if you're just trading one for the other, then we're not looking at any profound change, but really something that's merely cosmetic. In spite of everything, I am somewhat hopeful, but I think what we need to look at is not necessarily at the masses, but at the minorities. The individuals, we're going to stand up, we're going to stand out, and we're going to inspire. But looking at humanity as a collective, I think we're pretty content watching TikTok, playing Angry Birds, and throwing a pigskin around. So yeah, that's my convoluted answer. Sorry for that. I'm just happy.
Thanks. Thanks for responding to the question to Nazapi, ma'am. Is there any other question from the audience? Yeah, if not, perhaps maybe you could. What we are trying to do, as you know, on this project is to sort of connect the dots between the African science fiction writers, researchers in sort of the African context, and we know that some of the works that have been developed on science fiction with African writers have sort of found themselves into the Western sphere, where they're more easily accessible than in the African context. And I just wanted to pick your brains in terms of, is this another form of extractivism? You've talked about extractivism from a geopolitical perspective, but is this also another form of that extractivism as well?
Thank you for that, Onesimus. If there are no questions, I hope it's not out of sheer disappointment. You're possibly just still brewing it over and thinking something up.
No, I don't think so. I think people are thinking behind the scenes.
Well, it was a lot of information at once. Well, look, I'm going to be honest with you. I tend to be very self-critical when it comes to these things. I think it's entirely too easy to blame the West for Africans publishing in the West. I think it's also too easy to blame the West for the medical brain drain of Africans. I think it's too easy to blame the West 60 years after independence for every single one of Africa's problems. I think at some point or another, yes, you can say that, well, there was a setback in time because this, that, and the other thing happened. But I used to work in migration. I worked in migration for almost a decade. If you talk to African doctors, and that litany has not changed 10 years later, and it had already started 10 years prior, meaning where are the African governments? How are they not doing something about this when the grievances are that clear? And the grievances are, we are not going to Europe because we want to leave Africa. We're not going to Europe because we're looking for higher salaries. We're going to Europe because we want to apply what we've learned in medical school. If we could work in African hospitals, we would do that. We have African leaders. A lot of people will say that Africa doesn't have good hospitals because African leaders don't use them. If you can afford to fly to Paris, why would you worry about having the same quality of service in Dakar or in Abidjan or anywhere? So there's a major disconnect between leadership and needs on this continent. And I think that's an issue that needs to be addressed. And that's an issue that needs to be addressed by Africans for Africans. Because again, those doctors, they'd be just as happy working in Accra if Accra had the same facilities as they have in London. The same investments were made in Accra as they were made in London. And it's the same thing to me when it comes to publishing industry. There is a publishing industry in Europe. Now, true, African economies were never designed to be supportive of the arts, particularly, right? They were designed for colonial purposes, and a lot of those patterns haven't changed, which is why a lot of our countries haven't changed. And again, you know, it kind of ties into what we were saying earlier about about toys, about self-involvement, about hedonism, about power, access to it, greed. It's very comfortable to be in positions of authority because you have a lot of money. That dissociates you from the needs of people on the ground. And that's not just true of government, that's true of billionaires and millionaires everywhere. The moment you start making a certain amount of money, you start thinking about things very differently. I don't know if it's inevitable, but I've seen it enough times to start believing that it is. Your position in life very much influences the way you think. So we're looking at a major disconnect between governance and needs, livelihood, and people's well-being versus what they can expect from the top and what the top expects from the bottom. But when it comes to the publishing industry, unless Africa develops a publishing industry for itself, it cannot blame people for going to other places to try to get that recognition. That's just a fact. And it might make a lot of people upset. A lot of people might argue, well, where's the money? Where's the this? Where's the that? I don't have answers to everything. I just take it, just my perspective on things, and my thinking is taking responsibility first, trying to be as self-critical as possible, and try to figure out how to plug those gaps. This is the 21st century. You worry about artificial intelligence stealing your writing? Well, maybe it's time to use artificial intelligence to help build up our industry. Online is the way things are going now. Platforms, magazines, all these things. Omanana magazine could not possibly have existed a decade ago, but it can now. There are a number of platforms that have moved entirely towards ebooks, making things accessible, partnering with universities. So books, look, you know, I'm in Senegal. The high school curriculum is still 50% French literature. It's insane. 70 years after, and 60 plus years after independence, people are still reading 17th century French novels. Those are great novels, but isn't there something that's more relevant to the kids? I'm pretty sure there is. So maybe it's up to people to start thinking about that, start thinking differently, start reaching out to universities, start reaching out to schools, start proposing different kinds of content. Of course, you know, there are also developmental realities. If you can't afford food, you're not going to buy a book instead, right? Yeah, exactly. So you know, everything works together. But I do think, and that's just me personally. I'm not trying to have anybody. I'm not looking for agreement or disagreement here, but just to answer your question, what I believe is, as Africans, if we want this country, this continent to evolve, to develop, we have to take responsibility for where we are in the here and now, and try to look at what we can change and what we have the power to change. Because the blame game is not getting us anywhere. And quite frankly, a lot of the times, as a diaspora, second generation, born abroad, I look at all that blaming, the African blaming this person, that person, Western this, imperialism that, and I'm ashamed. I'm ashamed because I'm looking at a continent that is not trying to stand up for itself, but is too busy pointing the finger abroad, and that's not going to work. It hasn't worked for us up to now. It's not going to work for us in the future. Yeah,
I totally agree with the finger pointing, whereas those fingers should actually be pointing inwardly. And I think there is a place as well for, you know, science fiction to sort of bring these ideals to the fore, and there is also a place to educate and to help the younger generation to see the potential that they can have within the continent itself. And it's all, you know, around leadership, the leadership and the vision of our leaders if that can also be something that can be seen going forward. The elections in Kenya, the last elections in Kenya did not endear themselves very well, and this is what is happening and playing into the field at the moment. And yeah, so it's something that we have to look at inwardly rather than pointing fingers outward. Is there any other question for Mame?
I saw something by Ms. Happy. Looking at.
Yes.
I'm sorry, Mimi. I'm sorry, Mimi. We'll do the feeling book
so,
later, okay?
She says, "Thank you, Mame. A scary set of prospects ahead of humanity. I suppose another relevant science fiction franchise is in relation to extractivism. Is Avatar."
Yeah, and I think Avatar is interesting. I think the first Avatar is a fantastic movie. If we remove the quote unquote white savior element of it, because obviously Avatar dances with the wolves. What else was it? Yeah, The Last Samurai. All those books and Dune, obviously. All those things bring in like a foreign element that allow the native populations to really fully understand what it is they're fighting against. Yeah, colonial expats who help them dispatch the oppressors initially. I don't think it necessarily has to do with colonialism per se. To me, look, leadership and that vision, sometimes it has to come from outside because the external perspective allows you to see things that people who are in the thick can't really tell apart too well. I mean, look, if you look even at Palestinian liberation struggles, Yasser Arafat was an Egyptian from Cairo. He wasn't even local. I'm not necessarily like deriding foreign perspectives, as long as that commitment is absolutely real. As long as that commitment is real. But yeah, true. Avatar is definitely one of those absolutely spectacular visions. I'm not a big fan of the second one. It feels like it's the exact same movie with a little bit of a Jungle Book element thrown into it. But I'm guessing he's rebooting a franchise that he had initially no intention of actually expanding. So looking forward to seeing what Fire and Ash is doing. What bothers me most with Avatar is that he's basically lining up the Na'vi with every single native population, the quote unquote indigenous population on the planet. So we had like Native Americans in the first one. We had Maori in the second. I would just wonder who is going to be reduced to like mutilations and tattoos in Fire and Ash, to be honest with you. That's my biggest problem with Avatar. But otherwise, I do think that the way it engages full on with corporatism, full on with extractivism, and full on with revolution, I think those are beautiful things. And also the environmental aspect of things, the natural aspect of things, the communal aspect of things. Those are beautiful, beautiful values that are put out there. So nothing is perfect, but in terms of the message, I think Avatar puts one out there that's pretty strong.
Yeah, I see John Buru is trying, Professor Buru from University of Nairobi is trying to type. Prof, do you want to unmute and talk it out instead of typing? Are you able to unmute?
Yeah, I'm able to unmute. But I was writing something very interesting because I was thinking of what's happening in the US, the Trump economics.
Yeah.
And then because Mame mentioned it a bit, but he did not go into the details. And I was wondering the connection of his work to what is happening currently in the US. Thank you.
Well, thank you,
Professor
Mburu. Thank you for that, Professor Mburu. Well, oddly enough, last year I had a story published in Interzone called Perpetual Motion Sickness. That's about a refugee. Well, it starts off as an IDP family from the northern part of the country who are trying to reconnect a wife and her two daughters who just lost her son to a militia, who are trying to reconnect with their husband in the capital in the south. Now, that country is absolutely not at all the future Nigeria. But it all takes place in a larger world where the environment is degrading, overpopulation is clearly an issue. None of those two issues are not addressed full on, but they're contextual. And that family tries to seek refuge in the United States, in a post-second Trump administration United States, where the US is surrounded by a gigantic black wall. And the United States has invaded Canada and created the North American Federation. And without, well, total spoilers, but by the time one of those people actually managed to make it inside the United States or the North American Federation, it's in a state of complete economic collapse. And they're still fighting rebellions with parts of Canada that are still resource rich, where water is still clean, where there's still access to foodstuffs and things that aren't completely polluted. So, and that was written, I drafted that story maybe 4 years ago, anticipating that Trump would get reelected. I thought Biden would lose the first time, but then he got elected the second time, and then all of a sudden the story got relevant again. My work engages with the administration, but that was preemptive. I was not expecting it to go the way it is going and for my story to hit so many points in advance, but that's where it is. So far, I haven't really, thought of what's happening. Too much is happening at once. And also I'm a U.S. citizen, so there's a lack of perspective for me. I don't have enough rear view to be able to put anything in words as to what is going on. Plus, I'm not in the country either, so it's kind of hard for me to even want to be that kind of voice when I think there are much more legitimate people who are going through the downfall of all these labor cuts, Doge, tariffs, etc., who probably have a much more vibrant message to say than I do. But my work has engaged with it. It's just entirely coincidental.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Prof, and thanks, Mame, for responding to that. What we also wanted to ask is, is about anticipation. So anticipation, looking at science fiction as a way of anticipating new forms of extractivism, particularly, linking it to things like what's going on in terms of the countries like from the Arab world buying land and forests in Africa to look at the carbon market in a whole. But do you think there is a place in science fiction, African science fiction in particular, to sort of look at these trends, emerging trends, and try to sort of predict extractivism in that sense? Or the only place we have in science fiction is actually looking at, the current and historical pattern, historical trends related to the extractivism issue?
That's a good question. Well, just starting with the satellite charmer.
Yeah.
Obviously, I really hope that technology never exists. Seriously, Jesus Christ. But I was starting from a place of now. Essentially, I was just looking at Chinese incursions on the continent and the kind of mineral and extractive deals that are signed. Because basically, a lot of those deals do not include the development of local industry. They are purely exploitative and extractive, meaning China could literally come in, take 5 metric tons of soil, and then do all the processing and extracting in China. And so that's what kind of gave me the idea for the satellite charmer. It's like, why even bother signing anything in the first place if you can just dig in? And also, it would be hard for me to imagine a space where African governments wouldn't be complicit because they're offered enough to look the other way when the worst of the environmental damage happens. I don't know if everybody's familiar here with what happened, was it 10 days ago, 2 weeks ago in Zambia? I think there was a spill out of a Chinese run factory that polluted the river for what, 1,500 kilometers or something, just absolutely abhorrent and horrific.
I missed that. I did miss
oh,
that.
Yeah, no, feel free to look that up. It's called like
Yeah.
Zambian River is killed or something like that. Zambian River is dead or something like that. Like, it's just absolutely catastrophic. And I was talking, I think it was to Ivor Hartman out of Zimbabwe. And he was like, I hope there's accountability. And I was like, I doubt there's going to be any accountability, because there's a reason why they sign these kinds of deals with African governments, is because they know that once they've greased the pockets that they need to grease, nothing is going to happen. So there's a lack of accountability. We could always blame China, but at the end of the day, China's going to look out for China. There's no reason for them to look out for Zambian people. It's the Zambian government that should be doing that. It's the people who are supposed to ensure that norms are followed who should be doing that. So when I look at extractivism now, and looking at future extractivism, I don't see much of a difference between the past and the present. It's just the scale that changes, the types of people who are doing it, but we're still looking at a continuum, right? I can't really point to any authors who are writing about this right now, but obviously, even if we look at people like Philip K. Dick, everything is a projection of the now, right? You're looking at, and some people have a better, are more insightful about these kind of things, and they're able to see, okay, this is a problem here. This is how I see the problem blow up and become a completely different problem, or a completely larger problem, if not a different problem. So I think, what's important, it's not necessarily science fiction. I mean, science fiction is great, and it does, it makes for spectacular visuals, especially when those things are turned into film, because the immediacy, the picture paints 1,000 words and all that. But I think it would be more interesting for Africans right now, not necessarily to read science fiction perspectives on extractivism, but realistic, even if fictional perspectives on extractivism, because it's a problem in the here and now, right? And it's part of the issue of our larger development problems. It's part of our larger governance problems. It's part of our livelihood and environmental issues into the future. And we're not going to change them in the future. We're going to change them day by day, starting today. So if there are authors out there, I'd be glad if anybody had any to recommend me, who are looking at these problems, not from a didactic perspective, but from a fictional perspective, something where they can bring in the emotion that you need to draw the reader in. I think that goes a much, much longer way, a much, much longer way. Now, the issue, obviously, is that if you want to get that work published, you're going to have to get it published in the West for the time being. But then again, it doesn't mean that there isn't space for conversation. It was Brandeis University Press that put out an academic textbook on environmental futures. Environmental futures from the perspective of Africa, Latin America, Asia, India, indigenous perspectives. That looks at multiple short stories, basically looking at the speculative angle on the environmental collapse, what kind of thinking is out there that can make a difference. Yeah, I do think, again, I do think there is room for that in literature. I think there's a necessary part of that should be in literature. I'm just not sure it needs to be speculative.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks for that. Yeah, is there any other question from those who are remaining? We still have about 10 people on the room.
Yes, I mean, I've just dropped.
Oh yes, I see that. But do you want just to talk it out?
Yeah, I mean, I'll sort of read it out and expand on that. You talked about the sort of blame game in relation to African development and reference to the sort of colonial powers. But, you know, they've had such a stranglehold on the types of leaders who could survive. I mean, those who challenged them were inevitably all assassinated, right up to 2011 and Gaddafi. So, I mean, this has made change very difficult. And this isn't a blame game. This is a reality, or it has been a reality. So, I mean, we're all, inspired by the crop of new leaders emerging in the Sahel. Notably, they're all tough military personnel who are now creating the space for positive change and challenging extractivism in their countries. However, Traore, for example, has had, more than 20 assassination attempts, within 2 years. And, it's a matter of time, as to whether, one hopes that he won't have to pay for this with his life and the situation go back to the way it was before. Hopefully the tide of change and the mood and the awareness, has reached a critical level. But it really has been a stranglehold. And it's one that normal people, average people, don't have the means, or the tools or the power to affect. So, I wonder what your views are on that.
Thank you, Nazati. Yeah. I mean, there's been a lot of forces at play. We're talking about the DRC, and we can look at Lumumba and the kind of wheels that's set in motion. I mean, there's a problem at the level of leadership, obviously. And it's also a ping pong, right? You look at Gabon and the influence of Omar Bongo on French politics for literally decades. And a lot of people would say, French presidents are decided in Gabon. Not entirely wrongly. But it's not just leadership. I mean, obviously leadership has been curtailed in some places. And I think what's happening in the AES countries was historically inevitable. At some point or another, there would be an uprising that would reflect the aspirations of a lot of youth. And by aspirations of a lot of youth, I mean the aspirations of a lot of young men. Largely because while I do see this as a historical, 100% historical renewal of a lot of African, what is the word I'm looking for? I can't think of the word right now, but I'm also seeing a lot of patriarchy that goes along with it. I see a lot of repression. I see a lot of women's voices being crushed in the process. So there are a couple of things at play, and I think eventually those are probably going to even themselves out as those countries emerge as a bit more stable. Right now, we're still looking at the experience as it's developing. But then again, I'm looking at the youth, and they're like, okay, good riddance, France. Welcome, heroic and amazing Russia. Yeah, maybe. I don't think Russia's interests in Africa are particularly African-oriented, but they sure can sell a whole lot of weapons to a military administration. And again, would those military administrations have risen to prominence if it wasn't for serious military threats? The threat of terrorism, all those Islamic armed groups, you know, they're a reality. They're a reality. A lot of people will blame the weapons dumping in Libya, making all of this very accessible. But I've worked in drug policy for years. The military coup in Mali was because the government was allowing cocaine money to make its way through the desert and fund Tuaregs, for the Tuareg independent movements. Just as long as they weren't fighting the government, they could let them use all the coke money that they wanted. All of a sudden, those same groups found themselves with a lot of money and a lot of weapons. And they start overthrowing their government, and the military steps in, and the government says, hey, but we can't fund you. And the government, or the military, overthrows its government in the middle of a civil war. So there's a lot of dynamics at play. I do hope nothing but the best for Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. I spent a lot of time in Niger, and I really like the place, and I really hope it works out for them. They're incredibly resource rich. But there is something, and I remember discussing that with some friends in Senegal a few years back. You know, they were wondering why our elected leaders cling to power for decades. And there's a very cultural rooting to that. That's a very African rooting to that. I mean, look, people talk about Paul Biya in Cameroon and his wife as Papa Paul and Mommy Chantal. They're not your dad. They're not your mom. They're supposed to be your president, who should have been long gone. But people still think of them as mommy and daddy. So there's this overlap between leadership and filial values that makes it hard for people to distinguish who should be in, who's in the right, who's in the wrong, and when it's time for people to be gone. And the conversation we were having was based on that. I asked them, but at the basic level in Africa, at the village level, what's the highest authority? They said the chief. How long is the chief supposed to be there? The answer was forever. If at the basic level, the guy is supposed to be there forever, how do you expect it to be different at the top? And I do find that there tends to be, especially among young African men, maybe because disenfranchisement makes you appreciate that kind of leadership more. But young African men tend to like strong men in power who bully people and who abuse their positions of authority. It's a sad state of affairs, but a lot of those kids who are supporting the AES just like having a strong, tough guy talking strong and talking tough. They're ready to ignore allegations of massacres, allegations of human rights abuse, allegations of curtailing the freedom of the press, just as long as that person is saying, hey, we're here, we're tough, we're strong, we're not taking anybody's shit. There is a lot of work on the continent. A lot of this has to do with education and making sure it goes into the right places. I am just concerned that looking at all this renewed leadership, and it's true in Senegal too, with Pasteur getting elected, I'm seeing a lot more young men being a lot more outspoken, being a lot more openly religious, and being a lot more patriarchal. So, you know, fingers crossed that this is just a transitional phase, a necessary transitional phase, a historically inevitable transitional phase. But while I'm cautiously optimistic,
Cautiously optimistic. Optimism is quite a good place to be. Just as you are talking there, it reminded me of the Kenya, you know, this small problems we had with Kenya with the youth and how they rose against, you know, this financial bill that was going to be atrocious to everyone. So there are some voices that are coming. We should try and be optimistic about the whole thing. Thanks for that response, Mame. And what I wanted to ask you finally is what you're working on. You're saying you're working on a novel at the moment. How is that panning out, and when do we expect to see the book for us to delve into it? And give us a bit of a test to what is to come.
Never talk about works in progress, man. Never talk about works in progress. Well, Sinangpon is here, so I owe him an update, but my priority right now is completing the story that I owe him for the workshop on mangroves in Benin. Sinangpon, happy to hop on that conference call and give you the nitty gritty of what happened, what didn't happen, and what still needs to happen. But that's the work. That's the work right now. And I was not completely committed because I was also focusing on this seminar now. But now that this is done, I'm going to put in a lot more time to try to beat that deadline, which I think I've missed by a month already. So, but it's happening. It's happening. So there's that.
Good.
There's that. So the novel, I drafted the novel last year already. I drafted the novel in 4 months, sometime between like November and March of 2023 and 2024. I completed it on the plane on the way to Florida, actually. Then I followed Stephen King's advice of sitting on it for 3 months and then looking at it after 3 months. And then I submitted it to my agent, who told me, there's a germ of a good idea in there. And I thought, oh, well, that's not bad. It could be, it's not as bad as trash that thing and start from scratch.
That's good news.
Well, yeah, I mean, she gave me some advice, like she needed some rewrites. So I rethought the story. I had it drafted completely again by November, but then I was due to submit it to her in February. So I figured, let me sit on it a little bit longer. Wrapped up the edits in December. Thought I still had a couple of months. Sent it to a couple of beta readers, all of which are incredibly positive. But right now it's sitting with my agent, and I'm waiting for her feedback to know what the next steps are. But hopefully the sooner the better. I don't know. Long form doesn't come naturally to me. It is starting to. And I have another work in progress that could turn into a novel any day if I can sign that book deal and get motivated. That's the problem. I like finishing a story. I hate writing it. So every excuse is a perfect one not to write until I realize I'm behind by weeks, and then the procrastination bubble explodes, and then I just deliver 5,000 words in a day. So it's everything is a work in progress right now, but hopefully we'll know. Hopefully I'll get some feedback, and hopefully I'll be able to let you know. And that's what it is.
Yeah. No, thanks, Mame. We'll be watching this space for when the book is published, and we will endeavor to delve into it. And perhaps you can come back and give a seminar around that. But just to finish up by saying thank you so much, and thank you for bearing with my mistakes with the with the geographical time zones, and thank you for really taking time to give us such a lovely seminar, and thank you for everyone who's participated and also managed to to think around the questions, and thank you for responding to all our questions, Mame.
Thank you for having me in this, Ms. And thank you, Paulina.
Thank you so much, and have a wonderful day. And I saw your daughter just tipping through.
Yeah, no, I bought her a kite yesterday, so she's been pestering me since yesterday to help her fly that kite, which I guess is what I'm going to have to do for the rest of the day.
I know that feeling. Yeah. Yeah, I have a 7-year-old, and she's she can be quite demanding, but there you go.
Yeah. Well, thanks for taking the time, everybody. Really appreciate it. Onesimus, if anybody has any follow-up questions or anything, feel free to share my Gmail address with anybody, if anybody's interested. If you need to reach out to me, always happy to take questions. Always happy to chat more. Obviously, I just saw your response. And as happy. I'm not trying to. I'm just saying, I'm just talking from where I stand, and I realize that you know, there are a lot of dynamics and a lot of things we could you know, pull out thread by thread, and we still wouldn't be any closer to the truth. But what's important is that we're talking about it, I think.
Talking is important. I agree with you. Yeah, talking around these issues is absolutely key. But thank you very much for your time, and God bless.
All right.
Yeah.
Have a good day.
Bye-bye for now. Bye. Bye.